G'day everyone, welcome to this AP4D webinar, Australia and World Affairs 2016 to 2022. My name's Tom Barber and I'm the Program Manager here at AP4D. Before we begin, this webinar is being live captioned, so if you'd like to view those captions, please just click the Show Captions icon in the Zoom Meeting Control toolbar. It's the little CC logo that you'll see there and you'll get the captions coming up in your Zoom app. And before we begin also, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where I'm joining, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'll pay my respect to their elders past and present, and also extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us today. So it's great to host the online launch of this volume. It's the 13th in a long-running series from the Australian Institute of International Affairs that goes back to the 1950s. And in many ways, it's the definitive historical account of Australia's international engagement, released every 5 years. So this volume has some fascinating chapters from a great lineup of contributing authors, including AP4D Executive Director Melissa Conley-Tyler and a couple of our advisory group members in Joanne Wallace and Huang Letour. Also, lots of other really great authors in there too. So for those of you looking to purchase a copy, we'll pop a link in the chat for you to follow. It's nice also on a small personal note to be involved in this launch. So I was actually one of the co-editor, Professor Baogang He's research assistant back in 2019, and I did some literature reviews and of previous volumes for summaries for some of the authors for this volume. So it's a nice kind of little putting a bow on it for me. But in terms of AP4D's interest in hosting this event, so obviously 2016 to 2020 is quite a period characterized by profound disruption, I guess you could put it. If you think back to, 2016, we had the Brexit referendum, we had Trump's first election victory. 2020, we had, the world was in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic and then everything in between. So, for an organisation like AP4D, whose rationale is that in a more contested world, Australia needs to use and coordinate all its tools of statecraft, it's really no coincidence that this kind of period has a lot of things to look at, and indeed it was during when AP4D was established. So I guess as well, reinforcing this is the fact that, that kind of core message of using all tools of statecraft, that's since become embedded within government rhetoric, within policy documents, and it's clearly to some extent a result of trends and things that were happening during this time. So in that sense as well, it's really timely because the world isn't looking like it's going to calm down anytime soon. We've got the Trump redux happening, and we've got all the kind of trends that were starting off in this period are really becoming more acute. If you think to, the climate challenge isn't going away, you have US-China relations, going through another trough potentially coming up with economic sanctions and tariffs and all that kind of thing. So yeah, just really important lessons to be learned, I think, is a key thing from this volume, even though it covers a period that's, going on 8 years or so now. So just to give you a quick outline of today's agenda, we'll first hear from co-editor Baogang He, a quick overview he'll give of the volume, and kind of summary of from an editor's perspective. Then we'll have a bit of an in-conversation with two of his fellow editors, Danielle Chubb and David Hunt, and another contributing author, Beck Stratting. And there'll be plenty of time for audience questions, so please do use the Zoom Q&A function throughout the webinar, and we'll get to those towards the end. So another quick reminder that we are live captioning this webinar, so if you'd like to see those captions, just click the CC icon in the Zoom meeting control bar. So I think that's probably enough for me. So what we might do now is we'll go to Professor Baogang He, who's the Alfred Deakin Professor and Chair of International Relations at Deakin University. He'll give us a bit of context behind this volume and a summary of it. So over to you, Baogang. Oh, I think you're just on mute there.
Okay, so can you hear me now? Excellent. Thank you, Thomas. First, let us, Daniel, David, and myself, express our sincere gratitude to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, in particular for the former director, Melissa Tyler, who offered us this editorship of Australian World Affairs in 2018. To execute this editorial project, we continue the thematic approach adopted by the most recent edited book. For example, this title is Trading on the Airlines Securities. So this edit volume has a four distinctive features. First, we give a substantial coverage of changing nature of Australia's external environment, in particular impact of increased US-China rivalry on the Australia foreign policy and the Asian regions. Second, these editorial volumes give more voice to female scholars. As a result, currently in this volume, there are 11 female authors, 9 male authors. Third, we first try to initiate a regional debate and cover the perspective from the Asian region, assigned to one chapter written by Professor Sen Tan from Singapore. So that's a kind of first experiment. Fourth, we made a strong effort to ask each author to approach their theme, a topic, from a historical perspective. To support this, we were fortunate to receive a small grant from Alfred Deakin Research Institute, and allowed us to hire a research assistant. Tom, I'm really thank you, appreciate your great, wonderful literature review. So the Thomas will conduct a comprehensive literature review on each themes from the previous volume. Then we send those review to each authors, and several authors utilize these resources in developing their chapter. Here you can see several chapters. They are trace back some historical trends. So let me say a few words about what is not covered. As an edit of this collection, we had intended to include chapters on the topic such as Australia's involvement in debates about human rights, its engagement with United Nations, and more broadly, and the politics of international regional trade agreement. It, however, was not possible to include a chapter on those topics. I remember in particular, we are first try to get a policymaker, someone work with the trade, Department of Trade, and to write a chapter. But in the end, he pulled out because when you ask the government official to write, they need to get government approve. So reader of the previous volume of Australian World Affairs will also notice that this time there are no chapter devoted specific bilateral relations. Our volume just have a first domestic politics of Australia foreign policy. Second, look at the global aspect. Third, look at the regional aspect. So in keeping the commitment to the thematic structure, we ensure all those important topics are covered to some extent in the 13 chapters. So this edited volume covers period from 2016 to 2020 and was originally scheduled for publication in 2021, 2022. But unfortunately, COVID-19 caused a delay to both the two planned workshops and the publication timeline. We were lucky to get also a small grant from Deakin to organize second workshop in person. But suddenly COVID struck again. So then we have to cancel the second face-to-face workshop. And the other reason for delay is the changes published from the Oxford to Cambridge. Then the negotiation copyrights. So currently Cambridge University Press own all the copyrights of a previous volume. in this volume, the subtitle is Return to Great-Power Rivalry. It says that we made a right decision to adopt such a subtitle. Most chapter has touched on this theme from different perspectives. This edited book describes re-emergence of the great power competition between United States and China, discuss how it reshaping the external environment and the strategy space for Australian foreign policy, and examine how Canberra respond to it. So the reader might be well know this volume. The subtitle is the Middle Power Dream. This is a really good subtitle. Really, in that period, 2006 to 2010, this is probably the golden time for Australia to be a great middle power, impact the world politics. But in the period we uncover, unfortunately, is a return to great power. So Australia, the initiative, a lot of creative idea has been constrained by this great power rivalry. It will be to be continue to do so in the maybe next 5 to 10 years. So I start over here, and the other individual order, we got the Becky here, the Debbie and Daniel. They will talk more about a detailed chapter. Let me just thank the Melissa Tyler again. Thank you for her support, and also thanks Tom's Barber again. Thank you for your support. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Baogang. I think that's very helpful background there, and just enough of an overview to try to whet people's appetite along with the discussion today. So, and again, before I introduce our next speakers, just a quick reminder to please do use the Zoom Q&A function to ask your questions. You know, if you leave it to the last minute, there's usually a late flyer and we might not get to them. So get in ahead of the queue. All right, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our panelists today. So we have Beck Strading, who's the Director of La Trobe Asia and a Professor in Politics and International Relations at La Trobe University. She also leads the Blue Security Program, of which AP4D is a part, which focuses on maritime security issues in the Indo-Pacific. Welcome, Beck. And we also have two of the other co-editors along with Baogang. So we have Danielle Chubb, who's Associate Professor in International Relations and a member of the Polis Group in the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University. Welcome, Danielle. And we have Danielle's colleague, David Hunt, who is also at Deakin University and who is an Associate Professor in International Relations in the School of Humanities and Social Science. So welcome to you all. It's really great to have everyone on board. And I think we'll dive right into it. So I might start with you, Beck. So, and just to make sure everyone remembers, this is looking at the period 2016 to 2020. Even though a lot of the things you hear, you could probably think, oh, hang on, that's very applicable today. But so in your chapter with Sarah Percy, you write that Australia's security landscape experienced both substantial continuity and significant change during this period. You know, in your view, what stayed the same and what changed?
Yeah, thank you, Tom, and thank you to AP4D and Melissa for hosting this webinar today. It's great to be with you. More importantly, thank you, Danielle and David and Baogang, for editing this really important collection. It's wonderful to be a part of it. And I just want to reiterate Melissa's comment that you really did the AIIA proud with this. There was a lot of challenges and you were very patient with us and patient with negotiation processes and a variety of other things, COVID, and it's really wonderful to be a part of this. And I'd like to thank my co-author, Sarah Percy. Writing this chapter with her was an absolute delight. So to your question, Tom, look, I think as a middle power, one of the things that is always consistent is that we are preoccupied with great powers. We are preoccupied with navigating our relationships with great powers. And certainly since World War II, we have been, you know, we've relied on the United States quite heavily in terms of security. And we have come to see it as being a cornerstone of our security, and also a very important leader within the region, the Asia Pacific region that we exist in. And Danielle's chapter with Ian sort of outlines also this sort of continuity in bipartisan and public support for that alliance. And we saw during this period, even though things were a bit rocky when Trump was elected, that there was a lot of continuity in that support for the US alliance. But we also see, I guess, continuity in anxiety. It's almost a trope of Australian foreign policy, this anxiety about the US, its commitment, its reliability in the region, and what we need to do to continue to ensure that it continues to be an important player within our region. So I think the differences, and really Baogang outlined them really well in his presentation, is the return of great power rivalry. Like, we are back to sort of realist politics. You might remember since 2001, Australia was really preoccupied with some unconventional security challenges, preoccupied with things like terrorism, preoccupied with things like irregular migration. These were big political issues that sort of came to the fore. And we were preoccupied with the war on terror in Iraq and in Afghanistan. That's where our focus was in the Middle East. Well, now we've returned very much to our region, and we are concerned very much with the rise of China. And another dynamic that became really clear in this period was the sort of the difficulties in reconciling Australia's security and economic interests. And I think that's going to be an important theme in the discussion today, because Australia, in responding to its concerns about a rising China in the region, its concerns about things like Xinjiang, its concerns about South China Sea, its concerns about foreign interference within the Australian political landscape. In dealing with these, it essentially, over this time, abandoned its pragmatic foreign policy approach, which was, we don't need to choose sides. And it began balancing quite clearly with the United States. And I think that's a really big and important shift, and that this was in part driven by concerns about China, which, there are valid concerns there, but also driven by concerns about the United States. So we have this kind of paradoxical thing, at least I think it's kind of paradoxical, where we're concerned about fear of abandonment, we're concerned about our great and powerful friends, but rather than becoming less dependent upon them because of that anxiety, we lean into it and we become more dependent. And I think that is part of the story that this book tells.
Fantastic. Thanks, Beck. And you've raised a couple of points there that kind of touched a bit on Danielle's chapter, actually. So I might go to you next, Danielle. So your chapter with Ian McAllister looks at Australian public opinion on world affairs across 3 issues. 2 of those which Beck mentioned then, China and the US alliance, and also climate change. And in your chapter, you write that public attitudes towards international politics played a transformative role in the domestic political agenda between 2016 and 2020. Could you elaborate on why it was transformational and perhaps how public opinion impacts on Australia's foreign affairs?
Sure. Thanks so much, Tom. And I also want to reiterate the thanks to the AAA for their support in helping us publish this this volume. But more particularly, it was a real pleasure to work with my colleagues, David and Baogang, on this. And especially, I think the best thing about being the editors of this volume is that you get to collaborate with the most clever people in Australian foreign and defence policy across Australia and work with them closely to put together this volume. And so it was a real pleasure to do that. And so going to your question, Tom, so the chapter that I wrote with Ian, who's up at ANU, really kind of built on some of the work we'd been doing in a book that came out in 2021. So we just finished it when we started working on this volume. And that was looking at Australian public opinion from 1945, so the post-war public opinion, to try and identify trends longitudinally in Australian attitudes towards foreign policy and defence policy issues. And so we kind of had that in the back of our minds when looking at this small period of time, because obviously you can't look at long-term trends within a small period of time, but our analysis is very much driven from an understanding of those broader trends. So as you noted, there are three issues that really dominated during that period for the Australian public: attitudes towards China, towards US alliance, and towards climate change. And we can see during this period the growing, what we suggest might be the growing influence of public opinion on foreign affairs, and driving debates that kind of blends global dynamics with domestic political imperatives. And as Beck suggested, sometimes this has a paradoxical result. Australia is not, and it does not act entirely rationally within the world, and Australians don't react to foreign policy entirely rationally within the world. That's why we have this kind of sometimes messy, sometimes confusing, and often paradoxical effect of public opinion and of its effect on foreign policy. So very quickly, just to overview what the views were towards those three issues. Some of them Beck's already kind of touched on, so I can be brief. When it comes to China, this period was a really important one for the shift in views of Australians towards China. It just didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in the context of a lot more media reporting around issues, particularly to do with the question of investment in Australia's critical infrastructure. That was a really big debate in Australian media at that time, and also around potential political interference in Australia's democratic processes. And this is the time when we had the famous kind of Dastyari affair and other issues like this. So Australia went from seeing China primarily as an economic opportunity, as a kind of pragmatically as an economic partner, a partner that drove Australian security and particularly economic security, to having more concern about the potential security threats, both in terms of domestic security threats, in terms of the influence over critical infrastructure and democratic processes, but also for the first time in quite a while, Australians identified an external state as being a security threat. For a while, we'd been looking at more non-traditional threats to Australia's security, but China as an existential threat started to play up in the minds of Australians. In terms of the US alliance, these views towards the US, of course, occur within that broader framework. So Australians were, on the one hand, as Beck suggested, very concerned about a Trump presidency. And as Trump became president, these views solidified, in fact, driven really by his rhetoric, his anti-globalist rhetoric, and other things that happened, like the refugee resettlement dispute with Turnbull, which you may have all forgotten about, but that happened during that period. It kind of fueled public skepticism around the role that the US might play in the region. And we saw trust in the US to act responsibly halve from 40% in 2011 to 20% in 2017. So it was a very dramatic effect. And that rebounded again as well once Trump was out of the White House. And that's not surprising, because when you look at another indicator, and this is probably one that Australian policymakers are more interested in, Australian support for the US alliance, and particularly for the ANZUS framework, was very stable during this time period. So while trust in the US dipped, people became skeptical, became a bit worried about short-term effects, support for the alliance remains stable, reflecting that Australians actually have, I think, a well-informed and long-term view of the strategic value of the alliance. And then finally, climate change. So unlike the US alliance, where there's a great deal of bipartisanship on its importance and its value in the Australian Parliament, we know that the two political parties have not come to any agreement about how to approach climate change, or even how to define the climate change debate. And we see this perhaps in public opinion Australian people are more concerned about climate change than they are about issues like the US alliance. This was exacerbated in 2020 after the bushfire season, and it's become a really deeply polarised issue within the Australian political landscape. So to sum up, to answer your question, I think we can't, it's impossible for us to find a causative effect between between public opinion and its effect on foreign policy and defence policy, but we can see that public attitudes tend to define the parameters for elite decision making around particularly those three issues. So it kind of sets boundaries.
Fantastic. Thanks, Danielle. And you kind of touched on public opinion vis-a-vis China there, given some of the things that were going on during this period. And I guess one of the key kind of developments globally in terms of China's engagement was its Belt and Road Initiative. So I might turn to you now, David. So, you know, historically as an island trading nation, the major objective of Australia's foreign economic policy has been to strengthen links with the global economy. And in your chapter with Baogang and Jeffrey Stokes, you look at Australia's reaction to China's Belt and Road Initiative. I wonder if you could just tell us briefly what was Canberra's response, and does that response suggest that the economic and security aspects of Australia's foreign policy can no longer be so neatly separated?
Yes. Well, I suppose that's the sort of the short answer that came out from this period was in light of the BRI debate, was that the sort of the idea that there was a sort of a neat separation between security and trade in foreign policy was a bit of a fallacy. You might sort of say it's the sort of the Dusty Springfield view of foreign policy. It's all wishing and hoping that things are going to go right, but sometimes, of course, they don't. And I think it's probably but having said that, you could say Australia's had in the long run, had a bit of a charmed run in its foreign policy over a period of time. But it seems that charmed run sort of really came to a bit of a shuddering halt in about sort of somewhere between about 2016 and 2019. And I think it's sort of a useful reminder that there's always been trade-offs between these different, very important parts of foreign policy. And what if anything else, I think what the BRI debate and controversy in Australia did was that it sort of showed that the perceived balance sort of costs and benefits had shifted from a position where there was a sort of a tolerable trade-off there, sort of that was everyone could pretty much accept as being valuable, to something that was much less tolerable and even maybe intolerable in the eyes of some. So I think that therefore we can sort of the argument we made at the chapter was that this controversy, this debate, kind of really destabilized a sort of what was a long-standing established consensus about the value of economic openness in foreign policy, and pretty much putting it on a par with security as a goal for foreign policymakers. And instead, what you saw was this sort of rapid reprioritization of security, very much firmly over trade. You could say, of course, that this is a product of the inputs, the human inputs to the process. What you put in sort of produces what comes out the other end. And one thing that point we made in the chapter 2 was that you did see a real sidelining of certain voices and perspectives, those that sort of, by their nature, sort of place that greater priority on the economic side of that equation. Probably most typically or best epitomized by the DFAT worldview, and instead sort of a centering of sort of the voices, perspectives from the security agencies. I think probably the last point to make on that, though, is that these things, they're only perceptions. They are subjective by their nature. They can change. They do change, and it often comes down to the individuals. And I said the people that you have around the table at a given point in time. So while under must be said, a very particular set of circumstances, the Turnbull, you can say, have a go at, I suppose, but particularly the Turnbull and Morrison governments arrived at a certain judgment about the need to reprioritise. That's not necessarily set in stone, and you could say that the successor Albanese government has already sort of seemingly arrived at a different sort of settlement or different answer to that question.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thanks, David. And I'm sure we'll come to a bit more of that later in terms of economic statecraft and how that's become quite a key theme in international affairs. Before I go back to you, Beck, I might just quickly remind everyone, please do keep those questions coming through. We've got a couple that have come through already, and yeah, we'll get to those in about 15 minutes or so. So yeah, keep those coming through. So Beck, if a kind of coming back to what I was opening with in terms of, you know, the need to use all tools of statecraft. So if Australia is to navigate a more uncertain world, it needs to use all these elements of power to maximise its influence. And in your chapter, you write on the funding disparity between defence and security on the one hand and diplomacy and development on the other. Could you perhaps speak to the security benefits of these non-security tools of statecraft, if you like, such as development and diplomacy?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I'd probably call them non-military because security is the business of DFAT. It is the business of any kind of organization that is internationally focused in the end, because security is about protecting and preserving Australia's national interests. So even the idea that DFAT or development defence might be a non-security tool, I would sort of challenge in the first instance, because it really depends on how we define security. It's not just about guns and bombs. It's about the environment and climate change. It's about human security. It's about all of the things that help keep us safe and communities overseas safe as well. But so it's been a while since I had a look at this chapter. As been mentioned before, it took a little bit of time to get this into publication. But I noticed the last line of our chapter, my chapter with Sarah Percy, was a functional diplomatic corps would seem essential to guiding Australia in its uncertain strategic future, which is a very cautious way of saying we need diplomats. Diplomats are incredibly important for preventing us from getting into war. Like, war and conflict is a last resort, and the military should be about preparing and planning for war. But what we've seen in this period, and it's outlined beautifully in the book, is this process of securitization, where essentially you have military and paramilitary institutions that are sort of taking over. They're getting the bulk of the investment when it comes to protecting and preserving and even determining what Australia's national interests are. So in our chapter, we talk, for example, about the development of Home Affairs as a paramilitary institution that definitely has an internal focus, but it also has an external focus. We talk about, as you mentioned, Tom, the growth in the defence budget. I mean, that has only grown since that period. Obviously, our period didn't encapsulate AUKUS, but you know, this prioritisation of defence is something that very clearly, I think, happened during this period. And you also saw the securitization of one actor in particular, and that being China. And so our lens, our ideas about what security is and how we secure Australia became really tied to these constructions of China and the construction of China as a security threat. Now, there is some basis to that, but as Danielle points out, the shift in public opinion didn't happen in a vacuum. This happened because political actors and because certain groups, whether they're think tanks, academics, you know, particular actors drove a particular narrative that then shaped the way that Australia thinks about security. So absolutely, AP4D has been fundamental in shaping this idea, this concept that we need all tools of statecraft. And yeah, I see Melissa has just popped in the chat. The Development Intelligence Lab has done an outline of the actual figures around what's being spent, which can be very opaque. So that is really important work to make transparent where the funding is going. There's, you know, Elise Stevenson wrote a book called Face of the Nation, which had a very alarming stat that from 1987 to 2013, Australia's diplomatic network reduced by 30%. So, like, we don't have enough diplomats and we're not investing enough in that area. But as a middle power, We can't afford to do that. And we can't afford for defence to be doing all of the diplomatic work.
No, definitely. Those are some of the key kind of messages we like to try to get across here at AP4D, that you need to respect and resource all the tools of statecraft. There's a role for each of them to play. So no, that's really important points there, Beck. Thanks for that. And it leads in nicely to my next question for Danielle. So Danielle, your and Ian's chapter doesn't cover foreign aid in depth, but you've both written on Australian public opinion as it relates to development. So, you know, in recent years, Australia's aid program has perhaps come more to the public fore. How do you think Australians view their development program, and what role do values and interests play in that?
Thanks, Tom. Yes, we didn't cover that in our chapter because it wasn't one of the 3 core issues. And we also only touched on it quite briefly as well in our book, which was focused more on security and defence than foreign policy. So we wanted to look into the question of what Australians actually think about foreign aid. Very little research is done into public opinion in this space. There's a small and I think quite good cohort of scholars who are doing work, but it's like I could probably count them on one hand in Australia, that is. So but on the other hand, within the development sector in Australia, in the different development agencies as well, there has been an ongoing debate since the establishment of Australia's aid program around the purpose of that aid program. You've had different white papers on aid under different leaderships in different kind of colours of Australian government, put out what they believe Australia's aid program is about. And there's essentially 2 focuses that they have. Either it's about a moral imperative and a humanitarian focus, or more often, the aid program has been about the national interest, which is not surprising. And there is a view, I think, quite clearly from Australian policymakers that Australians are only going to support an aid program if we can show that their taxpayer money is going to advance Australia's national interests. That there's, it's an often said trope that there's no constituency in Australian foreign aid, and that's why it's often cut. And so for this program to survive, it needs to be put pragmatically to the Australian people. So we wanted to kind of test these hypotheses, and in the view of a changing regional strategic environment as well. This is becoming much more the narrative out of government. So our research showed that, in fact, a majority of Australians actually agree with the idea that providing aid should be for humanitarian purposes. And the highest support for aid, by quite a lot, is aid that helps with both disaster relief. We do know that. We know that Australians step up and donate their own money, and also are happy for us. There's never complaints about Australia contributing towards disaster alleviation, particularly in the region. But also there's strong support for poverty alleviation in the region. And I won't go into depth into the hypothesis testing we did, but when drilling down into why Australians support poverty alleviation, this actually support aligns much more strongly with a sense of global responsibility around values like altruism and fairness. Those who support Australia's aid program tend to also show strong levels of support for social welfare programs at home as well. And humanitarian crisis and disaster relief also show the moral imperative. And so just quickly then, when though Australians are asked to rank aid as a priority compared to education, health and social welfare, it does rank at the bottom. That is that it is something Australians really want to support, but they don't, when we look at limited taxpayer dollars, it's the program they least support. And I think that's where this idea of linking it to national interests come from. And while there is very, very high support for using aid to curb China's regional presence, while Australians see a relationship between those 2 things, when asked where that money should be spent, or what the factors should be that influence where that money is spent, should it be in areas that is going to advance Australia's interests in the region, the impetus is still from Australians that it should help the poor, before it advances national interest. So I think these are really interesting findings. And what it and I won't go into, but political leanings also do really affect how Australians view this. So it shows that Australians do in some ways take cues from leaders, although not always. I think that leaders of both sides have been framing this as a national interest question. I think the cues more come from their views about social welfare and which party is more likely to support that. So policymakers probably need to think about enhancing support for aid by framing it not only as a strategic necessity, but also as a moral obligation, and need to better address public concerns around effectiveness and transparency, because they're the other things that Australians are interested in when it comes to the foreign aid issue. So there's a lot there, but they're kind of the highlights.
Yeah, no, really interesting points there, Danielle. I know it's yeah, like we mentioned before, our friends at the lab have done some good work on this too. So it's a topic that it's really good to see work being done on it from yourself and from others. David, I might just come back to you now. So as I kind of flagged before, and as you flagged before, this period that the volume covers showed us that economic tools have become, really quite an important part of Australia's statecraft. How do you see this trend moving forward? And I'm thinking here of, the recent Future Made in Australia legislation, even looking at the US Inflation Reduction Act, those kinds of industrial policy, as some would phrase them.
Yeah, no, great question. Thanks, Tom. Look, I think it's fair to say that sort of the economic tools have certainly become a bigger part of foreign policy making, economic statecraft in recent years. And it's probably worth thinking about the why it's been happening at this time and how and why. And I think sort of part of the answer would be that there's been a blurring of the distinctions between foreign policy, security policy, economic policy, or there's at least an externally oriented aspect to all those things. It's again, it's sort of worth thinking, I think, sometimes about the shifts that make this possible and why it might have happened at this particular point in time. We've already discussed, I think, one of the part of the answer, which would come in, if you want to call it, the China challenge. But I think there's also probably a couple of other interrelated matters. And I would think you could sort of think of it as if you like, the willingness and the capacity of governments in countries like Australia and the United States to tolerate high levels of public spending and debt, specifically in relation to their responses to COVID, which also came into our chapter and also came into the book, sort of occurring in the final year of our coverage, but also more generally. You could also say that this is in turn, this higher tolerance for debt is partly attributable to the permission structure that someone like Donald Trump sort of offered upon coming to office. Sort of very famously, he was adopted quite a different stance to questions of the importance of managing budgets than most of the people in his Republican Party. So not only in the context of US politics did he offer a sort of a different answer to those questions about the importance of economic orthodoxy, but also other liberal democracies, including Australia, where for so long there was this mantra about the importance of avoiding budget deficits and that also avoiding industry policy, things like that. These were considered anathema. All of a sudden, Trump has made them palatable and potentially legitimate again. I think you could really see it as I said, the COVID pandemic in particular sort of really did sort of open. If Trump is sort of in his first couple of years in office hadn't already sort of ripped remove that stigma from deficit spending and from industry policy sort of gestures in those directions, and certainly COVID, I think, can sort of brought about a change. All of a sudden, you're seeing very high levels of public spending, and legitimately so, it must be said, onto overall, but particularly to save jobs, to stimulate the economy, develop and distribute vaccines, PPE, and the like. Separate to that, again, I said you found legitimacy for industry policy like programs such as Future Made in Australia, as you pointed out, the CHIPS Act, the United States, and of course the IRA. Separate to that, again, Australia in about a similar period of time, you've got sort of massive commitment, forward commitment to the AUKUS program, and also don't forget the Pacific Step Up. There's another sort of instance of economic statecraft that actually preceded COVID and the Trump era. So I think a sort of an issue to sort of keep an eye on as we look to the future is whether or not these foreign policy-oriented programs will remain a high priority in an era and against a backdrop of high inflation, rising costs of housing, low availability of housing, higher interest rates. Because of this, while all this is going on, we're starting to get greater demands from ordinary people for more domestically oriented programs. It's worth remembering that programs such as the Pacific Step Up, which again is debatable, but you could say is an important aspect of Australia's regionally focused foreign policy, is coming from the same pot of money as the repairs desperately needed for public schools and hospitals in Australia. So I think if Australian politicians want to avoid that age-old choice between guns and butter, they're going to have to explain quite clearly to the public why these types of economic tools are actually a very important part of foreign policy, and arguably more important than the sort of the bread and butter issues that perhaps the public sees in front of them.
Thanks, David. That's definitely a really interesting topic, particularly the trade-offs point. Can't have everything, so it's something that, yeah, it's good to have the public debate on and see what people think. So we've got a few questions that have come through the Q&A now, so I might turn to those. We've got one from Roshan Kulatunga, who's a retired commander from Sri Lanka, and his question is, it's about people smuggling, migration, but also he asks, what are the maritime interests of Australia? So I know, Beck, you've written a lot on maritime security. You've got a book out recently with our AP4D advisory group member Joanne Wallace on Australia's security, and a lot of that is about the maritime. So maybe you could speak a bit about Australia's approach to maritime security during this period, and maybe a little bit now, up to you, to where you want to take that.
Thank you. And thanks for the plug for the book, Tom. That's very kind of you. Look, I don't know that I can speak to the specifics of the question around Sri Lanka, but certainly can speak to the specifics of Australia's maritime interests. And one of the most important thing, in my view, that happened during this period was in 2016, when China refused to acknowledge or respect the arbitral tribunal ruling in the case that was initiated by the Philippines, the arbitral tribunal that was initiated by the Philippines in the South China Sea. So after this sort of ruling that mostly sort of found in the Philippines' favor, China was, it didn't take part in it. It has not acknowledged the validity of that ruling. It continues to say that it was not a legally valid process. This is when you see Australia really start to talk about the rules-based order, and kind of see a direct link in the uptick in the use of this term, rules-based order. And in fact, the book that we're talking about today has, I think, a whole chapter dedicated to this narrative of the rules-based order, and it was very linked to the fact that that Australia was concerned about China's actions in the South China Sea and its failure to acknowledge or support an international maritime dispute resolution process that took place under the auspices of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, what we call UNCLOS. Now, UNCLOS is an incredibly important convention to Australia. It is sort of the constitution for the oceans. Australia governs much more ocean area than it does land, depending on how you view the maritime area. It's anything from 8 million square kilometres to 10 million square kilometres of exclusive economic zone. We have 3 oceans, and we exist in a maritime region where maritime tensions are really shaping security dynamics. And this is occurring not just in the South China Sea, but the East China Sea as well, and Taiwan. And so this intensification of the dispute, at the same time, China was building artificial islands, militarizing those islands, creating the conditions for control over that space to the detriment of of the claims of smaller states in Southeast Asia. And Australia does have an interest in maintaining norms of freedom of navigation because 98% of its trade is done by the seas, by volume. So this is, of considerable importance. Australia's maritime geography shapes the way that it thinks about security, but it hasn't always. So there's been these concerns about sea blindness, that Australia hasn't invested enough in its navy, that it's been too preoccupied by land wars in the Middle East as a consequence of being too dependent on the alliance with the United States. But that has changed, and the 2016 period was vital to that shift.
Thanks, Beck. Got a couple of questions that have come through that I might package together here for you, Danielle. So Jerry Corsavanis says that, asks whether we've lost our moral compass now that aid must meet Australia's strategic national interests, not reduce poverty. And then Brett Saville has asked, to what extent has scepticism grown because there are real concerns about the effectiveness of ODA, overseas development assistance? I wonder if you'd want to comment on those.
Oops, sorry. That's my go and pick up my kids from school alarm. I've got to turn it off. So I think the first question assumes that we once were really keen to send money abroad to help people. I'm not sure that's true. I think maybe, I mean, I remember in the 90s, there was a lot more visibility, particularly around the time of famines in Africa, for overseas crises. But I am not sure that, we don't have a lot of public opinion data from that time on public aid, but when we look at the debates, there was definitely not a strong consensus around the need to do this for moral purposes. I think the debate has often been around national interests, unfortunately. So I don't know if there is a shift, but certainly I think it's true that we no longer even try to have that debate that the alleviation of poverty is a good in and of itself. So I think if that's possibly what is being asked there, and if that's a way to define the loss of a moral compass, then maybe that's an answer to that question. In terms of effectiveness, we don't know a lot about the elasticity of people's of public opinion when it comes to aid. So we don't actually know what a difference that would make or how much people would listen. I think there's also questions around how effective that kind of messaging would be around effectiveness of aid for outcomes. I think it's worth a try. I don't actually think it would make a really big difference. I think actually the more important thing is to talk about the ways in which there's a real imbalance, and the alleviation of poverty, if a good in and of itself, is something that we all actually have a stake in. And whether that's a national interest question or not, I don't think is kind of redundant. So there's some two kind of vague and not very satisfying answers to two very good and difficult to answer questions. I think David,
please. Yeah.
No, look, Danielle knows a lot more about this topic than I do, but I was just going to say, I think the only thing I know about this is I seem to recall a while ago there was a survey done, and they kind of asked people to sort of guess how much foreign aid Australia gives, and what came through was very clearly that people vastly overestimate the size of the aid budget, and there's a sense that this is arguing that Australia is very, very generous with our foreign aid, where in fact we're not. And I think if people were actually aware of the overall trend, they might think differently about it. But we don't know, actually. That was the point Danielle raised too.
Just to quickly follow, a scholar at ANU did some experiments on that question, and and it's true that people have very poor knowledge, but giving people correct knowledge does not actually shift their views. So,
perfect. We've got a question here from Moti Good from the Clean Energy Regulator, and her question's about kind of moving towards the green transition, looking at things like access to chip technology and critical minerals, these kinds of things where supply chains, I think relates kind of to your chapter a bit, David, particularly in terms of China's Belt and Road Initiative, trying to link up those kind of supply chains and things. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that in terms of how that dynamic is playing out, the clean energy transition, along with that US-China rivalry and that kind of dynamic. Yeah.
Look, I think to the extent that we're sort of making any real progress on that, and to the extent that we can, given our sort of very piecemeal approach to technological development in this country, it seems that we're going all in, aren't we? On the is it Pillar 2? Is that the one? Is that the one we care about, the economic one? For the of AUKUS, it seems that we're essentially making a very big bet in that direction. That somehow we're going to improve matters by throwing in our lot with the US and with Japan and South Korea and other Taiwan maybe. That seems to be the answer that's emerging from the government's perspective. Should be said that's not all of it. There is the private sector has its own views. Some of the tech developers in Australia will go offshore. Some of them will sort of develop their wares independently. But my understanding is that government is trying to sort of try to steer as much of that as possible through official channels. So that seems to be the emerging response.
Perfect. I'm mindful we're getting quite close to the end, so I might just ask you each one more question and ask for a short answer, just a couple of sentences, if that's okay. So, looking at each of the themes your chapters were on this volume, what are the key foreign policy lessons that the next Australian government should take from this period? I might start with Beck and then go Danielle and then David.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really useful to come back to this period of time, given that we're facing Trump 2.0. And I think the important lessons are that Australia needs to keep a cool head when it comes to dealing with Trump and continuing to maintain a kind of pragmatic sense of foreign policy, but also can't actually be deluded about the United States. I think that there's a sense of US exceptionalism that pervades the way that we think about the US. And we thought at the time that all we needed to do was survive Trump and things would go back to normal. And that has not happened. So we need to be thinking longer term about the United States more generally.
Sorry. Yes, my reflection is not dissimilar to Beck's. In fact, I think it builds off it quite nicely. And it's that we know that public opinion towards foreign policy and defence policy in Australia is pretty well informed, and people are pretty thoughtful about the way they conceive and think about things. And we need, at the one hand, more democratic conversations about our policies, not necessarily less bipartisanship, but more opportunities to have conversations around differences at the margins, but at the same time avoiding the temptation to plough into divisiveness and to use that for political gain. I think there's a real tension there that we've seen overseas at various points. So I would encourage more debate and more informed debate, and to take the Australian public seriously, and to not assume that they don't have enough knowledge to make informed choices on these important foreign policy and defence questions.
Yeah, well, what I'd add is, again, thank you very much for the points that have been raised so far, but I'd actually sort of I think it's worth remembering that when we talk about the period under review, as I said, there were two different prime ministers at that time. The second of those, Scott Morrison, sort of was there for longer and sort of probably gathered more of the headlines, but in fact, Malcolm Turnbull's contribution as the person who was the first counterpart for Trump actually played a very important role too. I said, if you haven't had the chance to read it, please do read the essay that he wrote in Australian Foreign Affairs a couple of months ago, where he sort of pointed out that it actually sort of basically predicted that Trump would win for a start, but that's the least important thing but that came out of it. I thought what was actually quite important is that he pointed out the value that Australia can add sort of as an ally, and part of the value too was actually being willing to stand up to the US and sort of maintain that critical distance, but also one's sort of loyalty to the alliance. So that's a very important balancing act, I think, that Australia has to achieve.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. Thanks, Danielle, and thanks, Beck. And look, just thanks to everyone who was involved in putting this volume together. It's a really great edition, so I encourage you all to go and have a look online for it. Thanks everyone for joining today and for your questions. It's sorry we didn't get to all of them. There was a lot of interest, which is great. And then just a quick plug at the end, AP4D's work covers a lot of different topics, including those that we spoke about today. So please have a look at our website, sign up to our mailing list to get more info on when we have events and things like this. So yeah, just once again, thanks everyone. Have a great day. And we probably won't be back again until next year. So have a great holiday period and see you in the new year. Thanks everyone.